The funny thing about learning to drive is that nobody warns you the wrong turn might change your entire life. Looking back now, I can still picture the exact morning everything began. The sky above Cedar Grove was washed in pale blue, the kind of early summer morning that promised nothing extraordinary, yet somehow managed to hold the beginning of every unforgettable story. At 22, I believe my biggest problem was passing my driver's license test before the end of the month. My best friend, Noah Brooks, had spent weeks teasing me about being the only guy in our circle who still depended on rides or public buses. Every time we met for coffee, he'd toss my backpack into the passenger seat and grin. "You're hopeless, Ethan. If you don't get your license soon, you're going to be 40 before you buy your first car." I laughed every time, but underneath the jokes was the quiet embarrassment of knowing he was right. I had postponed driving lessons for years because life always seemed to get in the way. College tuition, part-time jobs, rent, and every excuse imaginable had pushed the driver's test further down my list until it became this looming reminder that maybe I wasn't moving forward as quickly as everyone else. That Saturday morning, I showed up outside Noah's house expecting another lecture. Instead, he walked out carrying a football and smiled like he'd already solved my problem. "Dad's going to teach you," he said casually. I stared at him, convinced I had misheard. "Your dad?" Noah shrugged. "He's the most patient driver I know, and honestly, he loves teaching people. Besides, he'll never let you develop bad habits." Before I could protest, the front door opened. Daniel Brooks stepped outside holding 2 travel mugs of coffee. He wore faded jeans, a navy polo, and sunglasses that somehow made him look younger than I remembered. He wasn't the intimidating father figure I'd imagined growing up. He carried himself with an easy confidence, the kind that came from years of experience rather than trying to impress anyone. "You must be Ethan," he said, offering one of the coffees with a warm smile. "I've heard about you for years." His voice was calm, steady, and impossible to ignore. "Mostly good things, I hope," I joked. He chuckled softly. "Mostly." Noah laughed so hard he nearly dropped the football. "See? I told you he'd like you." Parked along the curb sat a silver Honda Accord that looked spotless despite its age. Daniel walked around the car, checking the tires with practiced ease before opening the driver's door. "First lesson," he said. "Driving isn't about speed. It's about paying attention. The road tells you everything if you're willing to listen." It sounded less like driving advice and more like something you'd read in a novel, but I nodded anyway. Sliding into the driver's seat, I wrapped my hands around the steering wheel. My palms immediately started sweating. Daniel noticed without saying a word. Instead, he adjusted the mirrors, fastened his seat belt, and pointed toward the windshield. "Don't look at what's directly in front of you," he said gently. "Look farther ahead. Your car usually follows your eyes." I took a slow breath and looked down the quiet suburban street stretching toward the horizon. For the first time in months, passing a driving test didn't feel impossible. I had no idea that this lesson wasn't really about learning how to drive. It was the first mile of a journey neither of us ever expected to take. The next Saturday arrived with a cool breeze drifting through the maple trees that lined Daniel's neighborhood, and I pulled my backpack over one shoulder as I walked toward the familiar silver Honda waiting in the driveway. Noah had already left for an early shift at the sporting goods store, leaving me alone with his father for our second lesson. For reasons I could not explain, I felt strangely nervous. Daniel stepped outside carrying 2 paper cups of coffee again, almost as though it had quietly become part of our routine. "Good morning, Ethan," he said with the same calm smile. "Ready to graduate from empty parking lots?" I laughed. "That depends on whether you are ready for me to accidentally drive onto someone's lawn." He smiled and shook his head. "Confidence first. Panic never helped anyone become a better driver." We spent the first 15 minutes reviewing mirrors, blind spots, and smooth steering. Daniel never rushed through instructions. Every explanation was patient, detailed, and easy to understand. When I made a mistake, he never raised his voice or sighed in frustration. Instead, he simply asked another question that helped me discover the answer myself. It was a teaching style I had never experienced before. We eased onto quiet residential streets where children rode bicycles and neighbors watered flower beds. My hands still gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, but each turn became smoother than the last. "Relax your shoulders," Daniel reminded me gently. "You are steering the car. You do not need to wrestle it." I loosened my grip and immediately noticed how much easier the car responded. Better? He asked. Much better. Life works that way too, he said, looking through the windshield instead of at me. Sometimes people try so hard to control everything that they make every situation harder than it has to be. I smiled. That sounds like advice that has nothing to do with driving. He chuckled quietly. Maybe it does. Maybe it does not. We drove through downtown Cedar Grove where small bookstores, diners, and family-owned shops filled both sides of Main Street. Daniel pointed out common mistakes new drivers made at busy intersections, explaining not only what to do, but why each decision mattered. He seemed to notice everything before it happened. A pedestrian preparing to cross. A delivery truck signaling late. A child chasing a soccer ball too close to the sidewalk. His awareness amazed me. At a red light, I glanced toward him. Sunlight filtered through the windshield, catching the faint streaks of silver beginning to appear near his temples. There was something reassuring about the way he carried himself, as though nothing on the road could surprise him because he had already learned how to stay calm through much bigger challenges. "You are thinking too much again," he said with a smile, catching my expression without ever sounding critical. "Was it that obvious? Your eyebrows give you away every time." I laughed, embarrassed. "I guess I have a habit of overthinking." "Most thoughtful people do," he replied. "The trick is learning when to let your instincts help instead of getting in their way." By the time we pulled into a small coffee shop overlooking a quiet lake, I realized nearly 3 hours had passed without feeling like a lesson at all. We sat outside beneath a large oak tree, sipping iced coffee while watching ducks drift across the water. There was no awkward silence, no pressure to keep the conversation going. Somehow, sitting across from Daniel felt unexpectedly easy. I had arrived expecting another driving lesson, but as I watched the afternoon sunlight shimmer across the lake, I found myself looking forward to the next Saturday for reasons that had very little to do with earning my driver's license. By the fourth lesson, the car no longer felt like an intimidating machine. It had become a quiet place where conversations seemed to happen more naturally than anywhere else. Daniel always arrived 5 minutes early, coffee in hand, and somehow remembered exactly how I liked it without ever asking again. I noticed little things about him that I had overlooked before. He always checked the weather forecast before planning our route. He waved to nearly every crossing guard and mail carrier we passed. He thanked every cashier by name whenever we stopped for coffee. There was nothing dramatic about his kindness. It was simply woven into the way he moved through the world. That Saturday, we drove farther than before, leaving Cedar Grove behind as the suburban streets gave way to rolling farmland and winding county roads. Golden fields stretched beneath an endless blue sky, and old red barns dotted the landscape like scenes from a postcard. Daniel encouraged me to keep a steady speed while reading the curves ahead instead of reacting at the last second. "Driving is about seeing what is coming before you get there," he explained. "If you only react to what is right in front of you, you will always feel behind." I nodded, realizing the advice seemed to apply to more than the road. After nearly an hour, we stopped at a family-owned roadside diner that overlooked a small lake. The place had checkered tablecloths, homemade pies, displayed behind glass, and framed photographs of Cedar Grove taken decades earlier. The waitress greeted Daniel by his first name before leading us to a booth by the window. "You come here often?" I asked. Daniel smiled. "More than I probably should. They make the best apple pie in 3 counties." I laughed. "That sounds like a serious claim." "It is. You will have to decide for yourself." While we waited for lunch, the conversation drifted away from driving for the first time. Daniel asked about my major, my part-time job at the campus library, and whether I planned to stay in Cedar Grove after graduation. I admitted I had no real plan. "Most people your age think they are supposed to have everything figured out," Daniel said as he stirred his coffee. "Truth is, very few actually do." "Did you?" I asked. He looked out the window for a moment before smiling faintly. "Not even close." His answer surprised me. Until then, I had quietly assumed someone as steady as Daniel had always known exactly where life was taking him. "I became a father younger than I expected," he continued. "I made mistakes. Plenty of them. Some you can fix. Others you simply learn to carry with grace." There was no bitterness in his voice, only honesty. I respected that more than any polished success story. "Do you ever wish you had done things differently?" I asked carefully. Daniel rested his hands around the warm coffee mug before answering. Sometimes. But if I changed the past, I would probably lose the people I love most. That makes it difficult to regret the road completely. His words stayed with me long after we left the diner. On the drive back, the afternoon sun painted long shadows across the highway, and the quiet inside the car felt comfortable instead of awkward. We did not need constant conversation anymore. Somehow silence had become its own language. As we reached Cedar Grove, Daniel glanced toward me with a small approving smile. "You know," he said, "a few weeks ago you were afraid to change lanes. Today you hardly noticed yourself doing it." I smiled without taking my eyes off the road. Maybe I finally stopped looking at everything that could go wrong. Daniel nodded. Thoughtfully. That is usually when people begin moving forward. I did not realize it then, but somewhere between the quiet roads, shared coffee, and conversations that reached deeper than either of us expected, I had started looking forward to our time together for reasons that had nothing to do with driving anymore. Summer arrived quietly, bringing longer evenings and warm rain that seemed to appear without warning. By then, driving lessons had become part of my weekly routine, something I anticipated more than I cared to admit. One Saturday afternoon, dark clouds rolled across the sky just as we left Cedar Grove for another practice route. The first few drops tapped gently against the windshield before the rain settled into a steady rhythm. Daniel switched on the windshield wipers, their soft back and forth motion filling the silence between us. "Rain changes everything," he said. "Not because the road becomes impossible, but because people stop paying attention." I nodded and slowed the car slightly, remembering everything he had taught me about increasing following distance and avoiding sudden movements. Traffic grew lighter as we entered a scenic road bordered by tall pine trees. The rain became heavier, reducing visibility until the world beyond the windshield blurred into shades of green and gray. "There is a small overlook ahead," Daniel said calmly. "Pull in there until it eases up." I followed his instructions, guiding the car into an empty parking area overlooking a quiet lake hidden beneath the rain. I shifted into park and let out a slow breath I had not realized I was holding. "You handled that well," Daniel said with an encouraging smile. "Most new drivers tense up when the weather changes." "I almost did," I admitted. Then I remembered what you always say. "Which part?" "Look farther ahead." He smiled, and for a moment neither of us spoke. Rain drummed softly on the roof while mist floated above the lake, making the entire landscape feel suspended outside of time. The car suddenly seemed much smaller than usual, creating a quiet space that felt strangely separate from the rest of the world. Daniel rested one arm comfortably near the window as he watched the rain. "I used to come here years ago," he said, "whenever life became noisy." I glanced toward him. "Did it help?" "Sometimes." He smiled faintly. "Silence has a way of reminding you what actually matters." His words lingered between us. I looked out through the windshield, following the raindrops as they raced each other down the glass. "Can I ask you something?" I said after a long pause. "Of course. You always seem calm, even when things go wrong. Were you always like that?" Daniel laughed softly, shaking his head. "Not even close." He looked toward the lake before continuing. "There was a time when I believed I could solve every problem if I just worked harder. I spent years chasing that idea." His voice remained steady, but there was a quiet sadness beneath it that I had never heard before. "After my marriage ended, I realized some things cannot be repaired simply because you want them to be. You learn to accept what has changed and become grateful for what remains." I lowered my eyes, unsure how to respond. He was not asking for sympathy. He was simply telling the truth. "Was it difficult?" I asked gently. "Very." He smiled, though it carried more reflection than happiness. But Noah deserved a father who could move forward instead of staying angry about the past. I admired him even more after hearing that. There was no resentment in the way he spoke about his former life, only quiet acceptance and a determination to be better. The rain gradually softened until sunlight began breaking through the clouds, scattering golden reflections across the lake. Daniel looked at the brightening sky before turning toward me. "Looks like we can finish today's lesson." I nodded, but when our eyes met for a brief second, something shifted inside me that I could not explain. It was not sudden or dramatic. It was simply the realization that somewhere between the winding roads, the shared coffee, and conversations that revealed pieces of our lives, I had stopped seeing Daniel only as my best friend's father. That thought startled me enough that I quickly looked back toward the windshield, hoping the road ahead would somehow be easier to understand then. The unfamiliar turn my own heart had quietly begun to take. The days after that rainy afternoon felt strangely different. Although nothing around me had actually changed. I still worked evening shifts at the campus library, still met Noah for lunch between classes, and still counted down the days until Saturday driving lessons. The only difference was inside my own head. Every conversation with Daniel replayed long after it ended. His quiet observations, his steady patience, even the way he paused before answering difficult questions stayed with me far longer than they should have. I told myself it was admiration, respect, gratitude towards someone who had invested so much time helping me. Anything beyond that felt impossible, and I refused to let my thoughts wander further. The following Saturday arrived bright and clear after nearly a week of sunshine. Daniel suggested we practice highway driving for the first time, explaining that confidence came from experience rather than avoiding difficult situations. As I merged onto the interstate, my heartbeat quickened, but his calm voice remained the same as always. "Keep your eyes moving," he reminded me. "Do not stare at the car directly ahead. Read the entire road." I adjusted my mirrors and settled into the flow of traffic. For several miles, neither of us spoke. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt comfortable, like sharing the same favorite song without needing lyrics. After leaving the highway, we stopped at a scenic overlook where rolling hills stretched toward the horizon beneath a cloudless sky. Daniel handed me a bottle of water from a small cooler he always kept in the trunk. "You handled yourself well today," he said. "You trust yourself more than you did a month ago." I smiled. "That is probably because someone kept reminding me I could do it." He laughed quietly. "Eventually, you have to believe it without hearing someone else say it." Before I could answer, my phone buzzed. It was Noah, asking if we wanted to meet him at a neighborhood barbecue later that afternoon. I replied that we would be there soon. Daniel smiled when I mentioned it. He never misses free food. I laughed. That sounds exactly like him. We arrived at the barbecue an hour later. Families filled the park, children chased each other across the grass, and music drifted through the warm afternoon air. Noah immediately pulled me into a game of cornhole, while Daniel helped another neighbor set up folding tables. Every now and then I caught myself looking toward him without thinking. He was laughing with people who clearly respected him, carrying coolers for older neighbors, making sure everyone had enough to eat before serving himself. None of it felt like a performance. It was simply who he was. That realization unsettled me more than anything else. On the drive home that evening, I stared out the passenger window while Noah talked excitedly about a camping trip he wanted us to take before summer ended. I answered automatically, but my thoughts remained somewhere else entirely. When I reached my apartment, I stood beside my car for several minutes before going inside. I finally admitted something I had been trying to outrun for weeks. I was not simply grateful to Daniel. I was not only inspired by him. Somewhere between the first nervous turn of the steering wheel and every conversation that followed, my feelings had quietly crossed a line I never intended to approach. The realization left me more frightened than hopeful because I understood exactly who he was. He was my best friend's father, a man I respected too much to complicate his life, and someone who had shown me nothing but kindness. I promised myself that night I would bury those feelings before anyone could ever notice them. What I did not know was that avoiding the truth would soon become far more difficult than admitting it to myself. The following week, everything changed without a single argument or dramatic confrontation. It began with a simple text message from Daniel early Saturday morning. "Something came up today. We will have to postpone our lesson. I am sorry, Ethan." I stared at the screen longer than I should have. Until then, he had never canceled once. I told myself there was nothing unusual about it. Adults had responsibilities. Plans changed. Still, the empty space where our lesson should have been stayed with me throughout the day. The next Saturday, another message arrived. "I have to help a neighbor with a project. Let us take another week." His words were as kind as ever, but something felt different. There was a distance in them that had never existed before. I replied that it was completely fine, although it was not. At lunch a few days later, Noah casually mentioned that his father had been spending more time at home lately. "I think he is finally taking weekends off," he said while reaching for another slice of pizza. "He has been working too much for years." I forced a smile. "That is probably a good thing." Noah nodded. "He deserves a break." I wanted to ask whether Daniel had mentioned me, whether he had said anything about our lessons ending, but the question stayed trapped inside my head. Instead, I changed the subject and pretended nothing was wrong. Another week passed before I finally gathered enough courage to send Daniel a message myself. I thanked him again for everything he had taught me and asked if he thought I was ready to schedule the official driving test. Several hours later, his reply appeared. Yes, I believe you are ready. You have worked hard. I know you will do well. That was all. No suggestion to practice together. No invitation for coffee. Just a polite answer that felt strangely formal. I read those two short sentences more times than I cared to admit. They were encouraging, yet they carried an unmistakable finality. I could not stop wondering whether he had sensed the feelings I had tried so carefully to hide. Maybe I had looked at him too long during one conversation. Maybe my silence had become too obvious. Maybe someone else had noticed before I did. The uncertainty was exhausting. 2 days later, I stopped by the Brooks house to return the emergency road atlas Daniel had kept in the glove compartment and accidentally left in my backpack. I rang the doorbell, expecting only a quick exchange. Daniel opened the door with the same gentle smile I knew so well, but this time there was a hesitation in his eyes. "Ethan," he said warmly, "thank you for bringing it back." I held out the atlas. "I figured you might need it." He accepted it with a grateful nod. For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. The familiar ease between us had disappeared, replaced by careful politeness that neither of us seemed able to explain. "How are your classes?" he finally asked. "Good. Busy." "That is good." Another silence followed. I realized we were speaking like acquaintances instead of two people who had spent countless hours sharing conversations on quiet roads. "I scheduled my driving test," I said quietly. His expression brightened with genuine pride. "I knew you would. I hope you remember one thing." "What is that?" "Trust yourself before you doubt yourself." Those words should have comforted me, but instead they made the distance between us feel even greater. As I walked back toward my car, I glanced once in the rearview mirror. Daniel was still standing on the front porch, watching until I reached the end of the driveway before quietly stepping back inside. I drove away with a feeling I could not shake, sensing that he was creating this distance on purpose. And for the first time since our lessons began, I was no longer certain whether the hardest part of learning to move forward had anything to do with driving at all. The morning of my driving test arrived with clear skies and the kind of nervous energy that made breakfast impossible. I reached the Department of Motor Vehicles nearly 30 minutes early, hoping extra time would somehow calm my thoughts. Instead, I found myself sitting in my parked car watching other applicants arrive, each looking just as anxious as I felt. My examiner eventually called my name, checked my paperwork, and led me toward the testing vehicle. As I adjusted the mirrors and fastened my seat belt, I heard a familiar voice from across the parking lot. "Remember to look farther ahead." I turned instinctively. Daniel stood several yards away beside his pickup truck, one hand raised in a small wave. For a second I simply stared at him, surprised he had come at all. He had not told me he would be there, and I had certainly not expected it after weeks of careful distance. He did not approach any closer. He only smiled with the same quiet confidence that had carried me through every lesson. "You have got this," he called gently. Somehow those 4 words settled every ounce of panic inside me. During the test, I heard his advice in my mind before every turn, every lane change, every stop sign. Check your mirrors. Breathe. Read the road. Trust yourself before you doubt yourself. 40 minutes later, the examiner signed my paperwork with a satisfied nod. "Congratulations," she said. "You passed." I thanked her, trying not to grin like a little kid. The first person I looked for was Daniel. He was still waiting near the edge of the parking lot, coffee in one hand, as though he had known exactly how long the test would take. When I walked toward him holding the temporary license, his smile widened with unmistakable pride. "I never doubted you," he said. I laughed, unable to hide my excitement. I definitely doubted myself enough for both of us. He shook my hand firmly before pulling me into a brief, heartfelt hug that lasted only a moment. It was simple, warm, and completely appropriate, yet my heart reacted in a way I wished it would not. We stepped apart almost immediately, both pretending nothing unusual had happened. "I was thinking," Daniel said after a quiet pause, "there is a small scenic route outside town. It seems like the right place for your first drive with a license." We climbed into the Honda one final time, Except this time I sat behind the wheel not as a student, but as a licensed driver. The familiar roads felt different, almost symbolic, as though I had crossed an invisible line. We drove toward the overlook where we had once waited out the summer rain. The lake shimmered beneath the afternoon sun, peaceful and unchanged. I parked overlooking the water and turned off the engine. Neither of us rushed to leave the car. "You did not have to come today," I said quietly. Daniel looked across the lake before answering. "I know." "Then why did you?" He was silent for several seconds. "Because some moments matter too much to miss." His words hung between us with a weight that neither of us could ignore anymore. I lowered my eyes, struggling to keep my emotions hidden. "I thought maybe I had done something wrong," I admitted. "I thought that was why you stopped calling." Daniel let out a slow breath. "No, Ethan. You never did anything wrong." "Then why did everything change?" He closed his eyes briefly before meeting my gaze with an honesty I had never seen before. "Because I realized I was beginning to look forward to our Saturdays for reasons that frightened me, and I could not allow myself to forget who I was or how much both you and Noah mean to me." For the first time since this journey began, neither of us had anywhere left to hide from the truth quietly waiting between us. For several long moments, neither of us spoke. The quiet around the lake seemed almost unreal, broken only by the gentle sound of water touching the shoreline and the distant call of birds drifting overhead. I looked down at my hands resting on the steering wheel, afraid that if I looked directly at Daniel, every emotion I had spent weeks trying to bury would become impossible to hide. Finally, I took a slow breath. "I thought I was the only one struggling," I admitted softly. Daniel let out a quiet sigh. "I hoped you were." His answer was honest, but there was no bitterness in it, only regret. When I realized I was looking forward to every lesson, every conversation, every excuse to spend another Saturday with you, I knew I had crossed a line in my own heart that I never intended to cross. I turned toward him. "That is why you canceled the lessons." He nodded once. "I believed distance would fix everything." I kept telling myself that if enough time passed, those feelings would disappear. I thought it was the responsible thing to do. I understood exactly why he had done it, and somehow that made everything hurt even more. It did not work for me, I confessed with a nervous laugh. Every week I kept expecting another lesson. Every time my phone buzzed, I hoped it was you. Daniel smiled sadly. "The truth is, Ethan, every Saturday morning I still made 2 cups of coffee before remembering there was nowhere we were supposed to go." His words settled into the silence between us, carrying a quiet sincerity that neither of us could dismiss. Before I could answer, my phone began vibrating. Noah's name appeared on the screen. I exchanged a glance with Daniel before answering. "Hey," I said. Noah sounded unusually cheerful. "Where are you?" "Dad told me you had your driving test today. Did you pass?" I smiled despite everything. "Yeah, I passed. I knew you would. I am heading home now." "Dad, are you with Ethan?" There was a brief pause before Daniel leaned closer. "Yes." "Perfect," Noah replied. "Come home when you are done celebrating. I picked up barbecue from that place Dad likes." The call ended, leaving another thoughtful silence inside the car. Daniel looked toward the lake again. "He has no idea." I shook my head. "No, and I never wanted him to." We drove back toward Cedar Grove in complete silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. That evening, we sat together around Noah's kitchen table, sharing barbecue sandwiches, laughing about old high school memories and joking about my parking skills. From the outside, everything looked exactly as it always had. Yet beneath every ordinary conversation was the quiet awareness of what had finally been spoken beside the lake. After dinner, Noah volunteered to take the trash outside while Daniel rinsed dishes at the sink. I stepped beside him and spoke quietly enough that only he could hear. "I do not want to hurt him." Daniel stopped drying a plate and nodded without looking at me. "Neither do I." "Then maybe we should leave things exactly as they are." He rested the towel on the counter before finally meeting my eyes. There was sadness there, but also respect. Sometimes caring about someone means choosing patience instead of certainty. I nodded, even though the decision felt heavier than I expected. As I walked toward the front door, Noah called after me, reminding me about the camping trip he still wanted us to take before summer ended. I promised I would be there. Daniel walked me to my car as he always had. Before I climbed inside, he smiled gently and held up the spare set of driving keys I had used during every lesson. "You do not need these anymore," he said. I smiled back, accepting the keys one last time before placing them in his hand. No, I replied quietly, but I do not think I will ever forget who taught me how to find my way. 1 year passed more quickly than either of us expected. Autumn became winter, winter gave way to spring, and before long another warm summer settled over Cedar Grove. Life continued moving forward exactly as it always had. I graduated from college and accepted a full-time position at the local library. Noah finally convinced me to join him on the camping trip we had postponed twice, and Daniel remained the steady presence he had always been, supporting his son, helping neighbors, and quietly living the kind of life that inspired everyone around him. We kept our promise to give each other time. There were no secret meetings, no reckless decisions, and no attempts to force an answer before any of us were ready. Instead, we allowed life to unfold honestly. Strangely, the distance that once felt painful became something that offered clarity instead. Our conversations never disappeared. They simply became patient. Every now and then we met for coffee, always in the open, always respecting the people around us. Those moments reminded me that real affection was never measured by urgency, but by consistency. One evening near the end of June, Noah invited me over for dinner after work. As we sat on the back porch watching the sunset, he surprised both of us by setting down his glass and speaking more seriously than I had ever heard before. "There is something I have wanted to ask for months," he said. Daniel and I exchanged a brief glance before looking back at him. Noah smiled faintly. "Did the two of you think I never noticed?" Neither of us answered. He laughed softly and shook his head. "You both spent so much energy trying to protect me that you forgot I actually know the two people involved." I felt every muscle tense. Daniel looked down at the porch floor, clearly searching for the right words. Noah reached over and rested a reassuring hand on his father's shoulder. "Dad, I have not seen you this happy in years. And Ethan, you have been my best friend since freshman year of high school. The only thing that ever bothered me was watching both of you pretend nothing was happening." Daniel looked genuinely surprised. "You are not angry?" Noah smiled. "Maybe I would have been if either of you had been dishonest. But you were not. You both chose patience. You chose respect. You cared more about protecting our friendship and our family than chasing your own feelings. That tells me everything I need to know." I felt a weight lift from my chest that I had carried for an entire year. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment before quietly thanking his son. Noah laughed again, trying to lighten the mood. "Just promise me one thing." "Anything," Daniel answered. "Do not make family dinners awkward." We all laughed together, the kind of genuine laughter that comes only after months of carrying unnecessary fear. A week later, Daniel called and asked whether I wanted to take one more drive. This time there were no lessons waiting, no driving test ahead, and no uncertainty hiding behind polite conversation. We followed the same winding road that had once terrified me as a new driver until we reached the overlook above the lake. The view had not changed. The water still reflected the evening sky, and the old wooden fence still overlooked the quiet shoreline where everything had first begun to change. As the sun slowly disappeared below the horizon, Daniel smiled at me with the same calm expression I remembered from our very first lesson. "You know," he said, "I told you a long time ago that your car usually follows your eyes." I smiled, remembering every mile that had brought us there. "You were right." He looked toward the endless road stretching beyond the lake before quietly adding, "I think the same is true of life." This time, when we drove away together, neither of us was afraid of the road ahead, because the journey had never really been about learning how to drive. It had always been about learning when it was finally safe to let your heart move forward.